Thanks for joining us at TTS Times Wire News. Be sure to like and subscribe to get fast and efficient narrations of the latest news articles for those on the go. We upload every weekday at noon Eastern Standard Time. See you next time on The Wire, and be sure to like and subscribe. While neither request alleges that Bolsonaro had knowledge of, or was personally involved in, any of the alleged murders or other crimes, they say he and other officials bear ultimate responsibility because their policies and rhetoric encouraged the attacks on indigenous groups. Bolsonaro's environmental record. From his inauguration through last September, Bolsonaro oversaw at least 57 legislative acts that weaken environmental protections, according to a study published in the science journal Biological Conservation, and a slew of budget cuts and restructurings of key agencies that protect and monitor the environment. The requests to the International Criminal Court note that Bolsonaro has staffed key environmental agencies with former federal police and military officers. The goal, according to Bolsonaro, is to put an end to the ideological framework of the sector, led by NGOs and entities concerned with the environment, Surma and Pt2 said. Under Bolsonaro's administration, enforcement of laws protecting the environment has plummeted, Surma and Pt2 said. Environmental fines in Brazil decreased 72% even as deforestation rates rose to a 12-year high. His environmental minister, Ricardo Salles, was the main architect of the remaking of Brazil's regulatory framework, according to the requests. In May 2020, Salles was captured on video advising Bolsonaro to take advantage of the media's fixation on the COVID-19 pandemic to push through environmental rollbacks. Salles resigned on Wednesday, weeks after Brazil's federal police opened an investigation into his alleged involvement in illegal timber exports. Salles has denied the allegations. His office did not respond to requests for comment. The impact on indigenous people. Surma and Pt2's plea comes nearly 50 years after the release of a damning government report that detailed thousands of atrocities, including torture, murder and land theft, carried out with impunity by Brazilian officials against indigenous peoples during the country's 1964 to 1982 military dictatorship. The mentality of that regime, namely that indigenous people should assimilate and have no land rights, has become ascendant under Bolsonaro, indigenous groups and lawyers say. It's a completely wrong mentality, but that's Bolsonaro. He comes from the school that believes indigenous peoples aren't peoples, said Ana Valeria Araújo, a Brazilian attorney who has represented indigenous groups for over 30 years and is now the executive director of the nonprofit Fundo Brasil. He sees them as obstacles to development, and when there's an obstacle, you have to remove it. Bolsonaro has a history of making anti-indigenous statements. He has compared isolated indigenous peoples to animals in a zoo, and in 2020 said that Indians are undoubtedly changing, they are increasingly becoming human beings just like us. In 1998, he lamented that Brazil wasn't as efficient as the United States, which exterminated the Indians. And as president, his administration opened investigations into indigenous leaders, including Surma, who have spoken out against his policies, accusing them of defaming him. Human rights advocates see a direct line between Bolsonaro's statements and his policies. After he took office, he fulfilled a campaign promise to halt the process of demarcating and protecting indigenous territories and installed a former federal police officer known to have close ties to the agriculture industry as head of the National Indian Foundation. The government also stopped enforcing environmental and criminal laws that protect indigenous groups from illegal incursions and exploitation of their land, tribal leaders and human rights activists allege. These policy changes, coupled with environmental rollbacks, effectively opened up parts of the Amazon long inhabited by indigenous groups, including uncontacted and isolated tribes, to mining, logging and agriculture. That flood of development activity has led to violence and the destruction of protected indigenous lands, according to the Article 15 requests. In 2019, when Bolsonaro took office, there were at least 256 cases of property damage, illegal occupation and exploitation of indigenous land, up from 109 incidents in 2018, according to the Missionary Council for Indigenous Peoples. One dead after car crashes into multifamily home and sparks large fire. In 2019, the murder rate of indigenous people reached an 11-year high. In one case, detailed in the January request, Amira Wajipi, the leader of the Wajapi people, was stabbed to death by miners who illegally invaded her village. United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet said the murder was a worrying symptom of the growing problem of encroachment on indigenous lands, especially forests, by miners, loggers and farmers in Brazil. In public comments shortly after the murder, Bolsonaro reiterated his desire to legalize mining in indigenous areas. A deterrent effect. To his supporters, Bolsonaro's decisive 2018 electoral victory gave him a mandate to carry out his campaign agenda, to enact market-friendly policies, limit the rights of indigenous groups, repeal environmental regulations and, in his words, authorize industrial, hydraulic and mining in protected areas. They also question why Brazil, a developing country, should sacrifice monetizing its natural resources when other nations got rich doing the same thing. In response to the criticism that he is mismanaging the Amazon, Bolsonaro has said Brazil's sovereignty is non-negotiable, calling the criticisms evidence of a misplaced colonialist mindset. And Bolsonaro isn't the first to open up the Amazon. Administrations across political parties have taken steps to develop the rainforest and curtail environmental protections. But lawyers and human rights activists say sovereign authority doesn't make it right or lawful to undermine the rights of indigenous peoples. No one disputes the sovereignty of the president to carry out a policy, but this policy must respect the rights of indigenous peoples, William Bourdon, a French lawyer who filed the January request, said in an email. The right to sovereignty cannot be equated with the right to freely dispose of the lands of indigenous peoples, much less to have the right of life and death over them. In asking the court of last resort to investigate their president, Surui and Pt2 said in their request that Brazil's justice system is unwilling to carry out a meaningful investigation into the alleged crimes. Deforestation of the Amazon has soared under cover of the coronavirus. Legal experts agree. Ana Carolina Alfinito, a legal advisor with the nonprofit group Amazon Watch, said it's unlikely that Bolsonaro would face an internal investigation in Brazil. The country's chief prosecutor is one of his allies. So she and other environmental activists see an international probe as their last and best hope. We'll never have true justice for his crimes if the International Criminal Court doesn't act, she said. Should the International Court step into the environmental arena, either through the adoption of an ecocide crime or by taking up a case like Bolsonaro's, environmentalists and lawyers say that just the prospect of court action could have a deterrent effect on polluting businesses, financial institutions and politicians like Bolsonaro. When you destroy an environment, you ultimately destroy your home, culture and people, said Valérie Cabanes, a French lawyer who helped prepare Surui and Pt2's request. We are part of nature and we can't guarantee our fundamental human rights if we don't protect the rights of nature to exist, regenerate and thrive. Katie Surma, Inside Climate News. Thanks for joining us at TTS Times Wire News. Be sure to like and subscribe to get fast and efficient narrations of the latest news articles for those on the go. We upload every weekday at noon Eastern Standard Time. See you next time on The Wire, and be sure to like and subscribe.